To kick off the second day of class this week, you're going to look at the content of the Mahapuranas, as well as the Samudra Mantana, the churning of the ocean of milk. The Mahapuranas are categorized into different types of stories and texts and so forth, normally called the Panchalakshana. So you have the Sarka, which is cosmogony, the story of the origins of the universe, and then the Pratisarka, which is cosmogony and cosmology, so shaping the universe as well. Then you have the Vamsha, genealogies of the gods, sages, and kings. Vamsha or Vamsa here means history. Then you have the Mahavantara, the cosmic cycles, the history of the world during the time of one particular patriarch or another. Then you have the Vanshanucharitam, which are legends during the times of various kings. A few Puranas, such as the popular Bhagavata Purana, add 5 more characteristics to expand the list of the types of Puranas contained within their collections of texts to 10. So they also add Uttaya, karmic links between the deities, sages, kings, and various other living beings, or Ishanukata, the tales about one god in particular, or Nirodha, the notion of a finale, a cessation, or mukti, moksha, spiritual liberation, or texts about ashraya, or refuge. These 5 or 10 sections, sort of subsections, or collections of the Mahapuranas or the Puranas, weave in biographies, myths, geography, medicine, astronomy, and notions about Hindu temples, pilgrimage to distant real places, rites of passage, discussions of charity and ethics, duties, rights about dharma, divine intervention in cosmic and human affairs, love stories, texts about festivals, theosophy, and also philosophy. The Puranas link gods to men, both generally and in religious bhakti contexts. Here, the Puranic literature follows a general pattern. They start with an introduction. A future devotee is described as ignorant about the god, yet curious, and the devotee learns about the god, and this begins a spiritual realization, and then the text describes instances of that particular god's, whether it's Vishnu or Shiva or whomever, grace which begins to persuade and convert the devotee. Then the devotee shows devotion, which is rewarded by the god. The reward is appreciated by the devotee, and in return performs actions to further express devotion. The Purana states flood are documents about the rise of sort of theistic traditions based on those of Vishnu, so Vaishnavism, Shiva, so Shaivism, and the goddess Devi. They also include respective mythology and descriptions of pilgrimage practices, holy places, rituals, and genealogies associated with these. The bulk of these texts, in Flood's view, were established by 500 CE in the Gupta era, as we have discussed. One of the key texts or key narratives that emerges out of the Puranas is the Samudra Manthan or Samudra Mantana, which is portrayed as the churning of the ocean of milk in this painting on the left-hand side of the slide. And actually, the devas or gods or asuras are portrayed on the right-hand side in Angkor Wat, in this long, etched into the side of a stone wall of a temple carving. The churning of the ocean of milk was an extensive process. Mount Mandara was used as a churning rod, and Vasuki, a Nagaraja, or king of the serpents, who abides on Shiva's neck, becomes the churning rope. The Samudra Mantana process released a number of things from the ocean of milk. One of them was a lethal poison known as hala hala. It includes the devas on one side and the asuras on the other, sort of demon gods and good gods, representing dharmic and adharmic action in this sense. And they're playing this tug of war game during the course of the Samudra Manthan. As the story begins, Indra, the king of Svarga, while riding on the elephant Airavata, came across the sage Durvasa, who offered him a special garland. The garland had been given to the sage by a nymph. Indra accepted the gift and placed it on the trunk of the elephant, the many-headed elephant, as a test to prove that he was not an egoistic deva. The flowers on it had a scent that attracted some bees. Annoyed by the bees, Airavata, the elephant, threw the garland on the ground. This enraged the sage, as the garland was the dwelling place of Shri, or fortune, light, brilliance, and was to be treated as a prasada, or religious offering. Durvasa then cursed Indra and all devas to be bereft of all strength, energy, and fortune. So the first incident is the cursing of the devas. In battles following the incident, the devas were defeated by the asuras. The asuras were led by Bali, pictured here on the left-hand side of the slide, who was an asura who had gained control over the universe. The devas sought Lord Vishnu's help, who advised them to treat the asuras in a diplomatic manner. The devas formed an alliance with the asuras to jointly churn the ocean for the nectar of immortality and to share it among themselves. However, Vishnu told the devas that he would arrange for them alone to obtain the nectar. The churning of the ocean of milk, thus, was an extensive process. The Samudra Mantana, or Samudra Manthan, was a process that released a number of substances from the ocean of milk. Now, one of them was the lethal poison known as hala hala. However, in some variations of the story, the poison escaped from the mouth of the Serpent King, the Nagaraja, Basuki, as the demons and gods churned. This terrified the devas, and the asuras as well, because the poison hala hala was so powerful that it could destroy all of creation. In one variation, the Lord Vishnu knows that Basuki would vomit poisonous flames when twisted and pulled, and therefore advises the devas to hold the tail end of the snake, Nagaraja, of Basuki, without telling them the reason. First, the devas held the head end of Nagaraja, and while the asuras held the tail end, they began to churn. But the asuras were enraged by this, as the lower part of an animal is actually impure, or at least less pure than that which contains the head. Therefore, the asuras insist on holding the head of the Nagaraja Basuki. Lord Vishnu had an inkling that his reverse psychology, in other words, would work. The asuras demanded to hold the head of Vasuki, while the devas, taking advice from Lord Vishnu, go ahead and switch to holding the tail. When the mountain was placed in the ocean, it began to sink, and Vishnu, in the form of Kurma, which is literally the term turtle, came to the rescue and supported the mountain on his shell. The asuras were poisoned by the fumes emitted by Vasuki. Despite this, the devas and the asuras pulled back and forth, and the snake's body shifted the mountain, causing the mountain to rotate, which churned the ocean and created coagulates in the milk. The devas then approach Lord Shiva for protection. Shiva consumed the poison, Halahala, to protect the three worlds, including Burloka, Bhuloka, and Svargaloka. So these three worlds would be protected, but by drinking this Halahala poison, Lord Shiva received a blue hue, which spread from the throat of his body to the rest of his body. In some versions, Lord Shiva drank the poison and suffered intense pain from drinking the poison, but could not die, as he was seen by Parvati, his consort, who's pictured here on the right, with their children Skanda and Ganesha. Now, Parvati immediately places her hand on Shiva's blue throat, stopping the poison to flow very much further. And as a result, by her, it stopped forever. Now, Shiva's throat might have turned blue, and he was henceforward known as Nilakanta, the blue-throated one. But in many portrayals, the rest of his body is shown as blue as well. In the final section, the final Ratna, the Amrita, the heavenly physician, Dhanvantari, who's pictured here on the left, emerged with a pot containing the Amrita, the heavenly nectar of immortality. Fierce fighting ensued between the Devas and Asuras for this Amrita. To protect Amrita from the Asuras, Garuda, Vishnu's steed, took the pot and flew it away from the battlefield. The Devas appealed to Vishnu, who took the form of Mohini, the only female avatar of Vishnu, and as a beautiful and enchanting damsel distracted the Asuras. Then Mohini took the Amrita and distributed it among the Devas, who drank it. An Asura named Svarbhanu disguised himself as a Deva and drank some of the nectar. Due to the luminous nature of the sun god Surya and the moon god Chandra, they noticed this disguise. They informed Mohini, who, before the nectar could pass the Asura's throat, cut off his head with her discus, and this discus was incredibly effective. The head flew off. From that day, his head was called Rahu, and his body, which was separate, was called Ketu. But they're immortal, right? So they can't be killed. They're just a head and a body. They both later become planets. The story ends with the rejuvenated Devas defeating the Asuras. There have been many hypotheses that the story of the churning of the ocean of milk relates to some of the origins of Kumbh Mela. The classical Hindu texts refer to this legend and state that while the Devas were carrying the Amrita away from the Asuras, some drops of the nectar fell at 4 different places: Haridwar, Prayaga, Trimbak, which is also known as Nashik, and Ujjain. So essentially you have Haridwar, now Allahabad, then you have Nasik, or Godavari, right, and then Ujjain, which is Shipra. So according to the legend, these places acquired a certain mystical power and spiritual value. A Kumbh Mela is celebrated at these 4 places every 12 years also. For this reason, people believe that after bathing at these places, in the waters at these places during the Kumbh Mela, one can obtain moksha more easily. Well, several classical texts, including the various Puranas, mention the Samudra Mantana legend. None of them actually mentions very specifically in a detailed fashion the spilling of the Amrita at these 4 places. It's later texts that refer to that. Neither do these earlier texts mention Kumbh Mela very specifically. Therefore, there are also multiple scholars, including Bhattacharya, who's perhaps the most famous, who believe that Samudra Mantana legend had been applied to Kumbh Mela relatively recently, so several hundred years later, in order to show that there was some type of scriptural basis for the Mela.